work and proving with it how designers can truly affect real change through national policies and design. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Atossa Sultani. She is an Indigenous rights and rainforest campaigner and the director of the Global Strategy for Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, currently active in protecting 86 million acres of rainforest at the heart of our planet. Please join me in welcoming the amazing Atossa.
Thank you, Adriana. Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. What an interesting, amazing, inspiring panel. I'm going to share my screen for a short presentation that I would like to share with you all. And yeah, so as was mentioned, I've been working in the Amazon basin for about 30 years, working with indigenous nations all across the basin. And my work has taken me to many countries, and we've been witnessing the destruction of the forest. And I want to tell you that people call the Amazon rainforest the lungs of the planet, but really modern science is now showing us how there's actually, Amazon operates more like the heart of our biosphere in the way that it generates the rain and moisture around the South American continent, but across the planet as well. Just to give a quick sense of that, is that each tree in the rainforest lifts up something like 1,000 liters a day into the atmosphere. And altogether, the 400 billion trees in the Amazon generate massive flying rivers that bring rain deep into the continent of South America, and also bring rain to, all the way up here to North America. The trees are key to that, and deforestation is causing the Amazon to reach a tipping point of ecological unraveling, and that basically could mean a dieback of large areas of the Amazon over the next 30 to 50 years. But that tipping point is being reached now in the next 3 to 10 years. And I'm part of a science panel at the UN that's looking at how we avert the tipping point. And really it requires a complete rethinking of our Earth-human relationship. So I've been working in the Sacred Headwaters region area that is about 86 million acres, the size of the state of Oregon, with 30 indigenous nations. This initiative came out of a response to basically huge amounts of deforestation and threats, where indigenous peoples united and wanted to really put forward a different vision for the future of this region. The initiative has been working on a bioregional life plan that proposes realistic solutions and viable pathways for basically permanently protecting this area. I'm showing you the logos of all the indigenous federations that are involved in Ecuador and Peru, representing 30 nations. And the Pachamama Alliance, Fundación Pachamama, and my own organization that I founded, Amazon Watch, have been a part of helping facilitate this process. And this is a quick map to show you that the biodiversity in South America is concentrated in some of the Andes Amazon region, where the Andes meets the Amazon. So in Ecuador and Peru, we see some of the highest biodiversity anywhere in the Amazon basin, and most likely the world. So the Sacred Headwaters really falls into the core area that you saw on the previous map in the red and orange area. That's peak biodiversity for plants, birds, mammals, and amphibians. Here, indigenous territories make up the majority of the landscape. Legally recognized territories and protected areas make up about 60% of this landscape you see outlined in white. And that is the Sacred Headwaters core region. We're also looking at the outside of the region, the buffer zone. And we're in the process of actually supporting land rights claims that would raise that 60% to more like 80% of this area being in some form of protection, indigenous and otherwise. And indigenous philosophy is really about living in dignified life and the well-being of themselves, their forests, and the planet. And here we are seeing a huge, tracts of rainforests that are roadless, communities that have been living traditionally in this most biodiverse area. And we're dealing with a lot of threats for territorial, basically threats from oil and mining and roads. I won't get into that. You can download this report to learn more about the threats. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the bioregional planning process we've been a part of. We've started with a diagnostic of, what is the bioregional process? What is the diagnostic of the problems? And really, this is a slide that just shows we've been dealing with centuries, if not decades, of extractive, colonial domination of landscape, cultural loss, deforestation, and pandemic on top of that. We've been spiraling downward, and the bioregional plan has been working to bring, basically bring this idea of a inclusive economy where we live in peace with nature, with respect for human rights, with indigenous peoples, respect for indigenous peoples' rights, that minerals and fossil fuels are left in the ground, the rainforest is conserved and regenerated, biodiversity is protected, and really the food sovereignty, health and spirituality of the inhabitants, and of course the health of the forests and rivers are prioritized. And that's the idea that this indigenous nations of this region are creating this model as a gift to the world, the whole of humanity. So the vision for the bioregional plan of the sacred headwaters is really to permanently protect this region as a treasure, ecological treasure, protected and restored as a living bioregion, inspired by indigenous peoples' forest stewardship visions and practices. And this is being basically this idea of a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship where people and forests are flourishing in a prosperous and inclusive well-being economy, where the region is contributing to reversing global warming and is a model for a just transition. So why a bioregional plan? Of course, looking at this region, this incredibly important river basins between the Napo and Pastaza Marañón river basins, we really see the connectivity between the Andes and the lowlands, rainforest, and it's really one living organism. To see this region from a perspective of how we ensure that this is a territories for life, where key stakeholders are working to ensure well-being of the people, ensure the indigenous territories are governed in accordance with traditional practices, where there's forest health and conservation, where there's an elimination of deforestation threats, and where extractive industries are halted in the way that they are consuming and polluting the headwaters of the Amazon. And I'll just start with just saying that what were the solution pathways that so far have emerged in a very participatory process of indigenous people's own solutions. And that is an agenda for action for indigenous territorial governance, the legalization of indigenous territories, the conservation of and restoration of forests and watersheds. And I know I'm running out of time. I'll just quickly say regenerative forest economies, food sovereignty, and entrepreneurship, intercultural education, ecological literacy, intercultural health, this idea of transportation connectivity. We've helped define agendas for action for all these pillars. Renewable energy, and really important for this audience is this idea of smart cities and smart urban planning, where cities see themselves as ecologically net positive for the bioregion. And really, and then systemic solutions, things that are going to have to be changing the goals of the system, like well-being indicators and keeping fossil fuels in the ground, moratorium on new extractives, and also financial instruments like universal basic income, debt for nature swaps, green taxes, and green bonds to finance the bioregional plan. So I'll stop there. I know we get more into the discussions with everyone on the discussions, but this is really one of the first places in the world at this scale where we're attempting to really promote an ecological civilization led by, guided by, where the beacon of are the indigenous peoples themselves. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Adolsa, for this wonderful presentation. What a meaningful and urgent body of work you're doing. And I also like to invite our design community to reach out to you, to Adolsa, in support of building your vision, right? And so now it is my honor to introduce you to Tom Newmark. Tom is the co-founder and board chair of the Carbon Underground, who is an innovator at the forefront of regenerative agriculture. Please, Tom, enlighten us with your findings and experiences in ground making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next slide. And this is just my introduction, getting to the root of the climate solution next. Next slide, please. I want to start with the bad news. For those of you in the audience in the business of landscape architecture and design, from a global perspective, you're about to lose your planet. Globally, approximately 50% of all productive soil has been eliminated. According to this article in Time magazine from a few years ago, there are only about 60 harvests of food left from our depleted and impoverished ecosystem. And this was not an outlier. More recently, the FAO has joined in that assessment that there are only about 60 harvests of food left. At the end of the Obama administration, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, I estimated that in the United States, by the end of this century, there would be no productive soil left. And recently, the Audit Commission advising the House of Commons in the UK predicted that in one generation, there would not be the ability to have economically viable farming in that country. Next slide. So let's consider what we can do with reversing that destructive situation with global soils. If we're losing about 34 billion tons of soil per year because of agricultural malpractice and degenerative agriculture, what can we do? What can we tap into? So this is the basics of soil formation. Looking at photosynthesizing plants on the upper left, collecting solar energy, drawing in H2O and CO2, creating from that solar-powered liquid carbon creating engine. Sugars are exuded through the roots of plants, feeding the entire soil food web. That soil food web grows, reproduces, and dies, creating necromass. And it's that necromass in combination with the basic building blocks of minerals in the soil that creates new soil. Next slide. The revelation from 2019 is that the key to creating stable soil is having diversity above ground with a diverse, varied array of roots of different sizes, dimensions, and depths, the right microns in size. And the reason for that is there are both decomposing and composing microorganisms. And if the necromass is to become stable in the soil, it has to reside in the soil pores created by above ground biological diversity. Think of a cookie monster, all of these decomposing microorganisms looking at that liquid carbon, those sugars that are in the soil. If the decomposing microorganisms have ready access, then there's really no net gain of tilth. However, if there are these soil pores created by above ground biological diversity, then you can actually create rapidly new soil. Next slide. The key is diversity. It's where biology meets geology. It's all happening at the root tip. The key here is that nature you never see nature creating food, creating energies of food in a monoculture, in rows with bare soil. You see the solar power of photosynthesizing organisms in vast arrays of diverse above ground organisms. Next slide. So as it's all happening at that point where biology meets geology in the rhizosphere, my question to all of you is, how does landscape design capture the power of the liquid carbon pathway, of the soil creation opportunity? I mean, look on the far left here at bluegrass. The roots are monoculture and they're shallow, but look in the native prairies where the roots used to reside. And that's what made the Great Plains great, that biological diversity of roots at varying depths and of varying sources, pumping carbon into the soil, and where the pores are such that soil can be formed rapidly. Next slide. Next slide. This is the mistake that I made at my farm in Costa Rica on the Caribbean slope. We originally, even though we were organic and biodynamic, we were farming in a monoculture. Next slide. We learned that we were actually denuding and depleting the soil organic matter, even though we were organic and biodynamic. So what we need is a global climate strategy using the power of biological diversity. There are billions of hectares of grasslands available to us. In just the urban grasslands of the United States, there are 40 to 50 million acres available to you landscape architects. And this is the footprint. Next slide. Scientists have found that we are able to sequester enormous quantities of carbon on that footprint of land. Next slide. And Dr. Ratan Lal, who contributed to the IPCC, tumbling all of the numbers, was able to demonstrate that if we were to regeneratively farm and manage lands worldwide, we could actually draw down 333 picograms or billion tons of carbon for the terrestrial biosphere, with the drawdown potential of 157 parts per million. Next slide. This is the great opportunity that is available to us. The climate solution is right beneath our feet. It's on the landscapes you're designing, and Mother Earth wants her carbon back. It's our job to work with Mother Nature and make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your work, as well as your recent scientific findings. This is an inspiring body of work that could actually transform the way that we use agriculture and landscape design towards climate mitigation. So I'm also very grateful that you shared your personal journey with us and reflections on how sometimes best intentions are just not enough for doing the right thing. So now it is my honor to introduce Victoria Kasaya. Victoria is a biomimicry specialist at Biomimicry 3.8, and she will share strategies on using the wisdom inherited in nature to inspire design. Victoria, thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you, Haya, and just such a pleasure to be with these fellow panelists. I'm already so inspired by everything that everyone has said. You can start with my first slide. Thanks. I'm with Biomimicry 3.8, and I'll start just by first unpacking what we do. Biomimicry is defined as the conscious emulation of nature's genius. And in this work, we view and value nature as a model and a measure and a mentor for our own human designs and systems and strategies and decision-making. The 3.8 refers to the 3.8 billion years of evolution that we draw from as our source of wisdom in our innovation work. And you can go to the next slide to further sort of illustrate this concept. It's a little hard to read, but essentially what this chart does is it compresses all of Earth's history into a one-year time frame. So picture life beginning on January 1st and bringing us to present day at midnight on December 31st. The important thing to note is that we humans have only been here in part of Earth's history since 20 minutes to midnight. And we've only been industrialized in our behavior and our practices for the last 2 seconds up to the stroke of midnight. And it's important to us and for us that we recognize humanity's place then in natural history and also in human history. And also know that we have so much to learn from our own species and those who have come before us, our ancestors, which is why it's so wonderful that we have Indigenous representation on this panel today. So next slide, this is the book that kind of launched it all, Janine Benyus's book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. And I love to put these questions up on the screen for designers because I think that they're so incredibly timeless and relevant. But these are the questions that Janine poses at the very end of the book as questions that we should ask ourselves if we are seeking to emulate nature's best practices and example in our own designs and decision-making. And what I love about the questions is they really call into our consciousness issues that are very timely today and also timeless. So questions of energy efficiency, of circularity, of equity and diversity, of recognizing and celebrating local genius and attunement, rather than perhaps displacing or gentrifying it out. And then this last question of, is it beautiful? Which, as Haya alluded to in the very beginning of this conference, the concept of beauty then is expanded to represent essentially the emergence of all of these qualities leading to kind of an intrinsic and interior beauty as much as an exterior beauty. And these are the kinds of standards that we can hold ourselves to also as designers of the built environment. So you can go to the next slide. So at Biomimicry 3.8, we engage in 3 spheres of influence. One is in the reformation and innovations around products and services with our clients. Also, we do a tremendous amount of capacity building in people through our workshops and immersions and degree programs. But where I'll focus today is in our place-based stewardship and the work that we're doing in the built environment. So you can go to the next slide, please. The vision that we have for the built environment is just a direct extrapolation again of the sort of biomimicry ethos, which is that our built environment doesn't have to equate to degradation. Development does not have to mean the paving over of paradise. And that we can actually participate in the local genius of our natural habitats. And the recognition that ecosystems themselves are inherently generous. They're generous in the provision, obviously, of energy and resources and relationships and ecosystem services, and that we as human designers can participate in that same genius and in that same generosity if we bring this biomimicry ethos to our designs. So there is some method to that madness if you go to the next slide. So what we do is when we're going into a development environment, we first look to the natural habitat and we get a sense for if it is in fact generous, which we know it is because all ecosystems actually are generous and species give more than they take, then how exactly is this ecosystem generous? What benefits is it providing? How is it functioning optimally? What are the unique geniuses of the species in place there? And how have they adapted to be resilient and reciprocal in that place? So we get very intimate with the place itself. And then we move into the biomimicry phase, which is where we emulate and incorporate the learning that we can take from that place, from the species in that place, from the forms and systems and processes in that place, and integrate them actually into the built environment designs through bio-inspired and nature-based and green solutions into the place itself, so that the place is generating those same benefits and acting as generously as the natural environment. And we do hold the place accountable through our own science-based and data-driven targets. And that's important for designers and owners ultimately to have that nature both also as evaluative process so that we can make sure that we're staying on track. So I could talk a lot more about that, but I don't have time. So I'll just close with this last quote. You can go to the next slide from Janine. I think it really reflects what we've heard from so many of the other speakers today, that we need to quiet our human cleverness, that humility is going to be a big part of design going forward. We need to quiet our cleverness so that we can learn something. Then we need to listen. And then the next step is to echo. And the final step is to give thanks, be a part of and not apart from the natural world. And if we do these things, hopefully we get to stay here. I go to my last slide. So thank you all so much for listening. I've certainly enjoyed being a part of this session, and I look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for sharing your insights on how we only need to look at the infinite wisdom in nature to find solutions to the challenges that we face. Now, let me introduce you all to Eva Long. She will be our last speaker for today. Eva is a Harvard GSD alum, an architect. She is the co-founder of and CEO of Seminarrrrr, Inc., a nonprofit organization bringing together designers, educators, and climate advocates at the intersection of architecture, permaculture, and systemic health regeneration. Eva, please, you may start.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Design Impact Team, for giving me the opportunity to share, not just from a voice of an architect, but as a GSD alum who has been in search for this conversation, one that didn't quite exist during my career at GSD and prior, back in the 2000s. So why design as a self-inquiry practice? I want to turn the responsibility and technology back to us as self-managing and self-learning individuals, something that we're not explicitly taught as part of design education. And I want to credit this to a lot of the work that Bill Reed and his team at Genesis does, and also Carol, two of my big heroes in this body of work. So what is the nature of questions that one would ask so one could renew ourselves and others? I'm going to take you through an internal dialogue that I live and practice design through a couple of projects. Next slide. So one of the first things that's required of me to regenerate is not just what I think I'm tasked to problem solve, but how I think about my thinking process. More often than not, we are taught to start from conceptualization, identifying the problem and everything below the horizon. But for me to ask questions that I don't even know I should or could ask, I need to rigorously examine and disrupt habitual beliefs, a lot of which are subconscious. And the quality of any design, I believe, stems from that. Next slide. So as Bill had mentioned, instead of starting a project as X square feet of Y program, I asked the question, what are we or this project in service to? This is the photo of the official reopening of a food forest pocket park in Somerville. And it captures the quality of regeneration that I have not felt in any other design project. While it is the end of a design phase, what is truly regenerated is the spirit and the renewal of roles of community. Next slide. With that as the starting point, I have to step beyond the role of an architect, and new institutional structures are formed, such as Seminarrrrr and many others. And that also became our organization's mission. We have to rethink what community engagement means and how that could be integrated into a very top-down conventional project delivery process. Next slide. And while we are approach to problem solve, quote unquote, broken amenities, fix it. We start the project by holding space to understand the inherent potential of a specific community. And leading to the emergence of a design question, the expression of which will keep on evolving beyond our involvement. What will cities be like if food forests become a new park typology and become an active participant in regenerating health? So this is essential for lifting up the energy from a very functional design process or transactional. Hire me to get the job done to one that is about building a field of reciprocal relationships long-term. Next slide. So regeneration takes consistency and rigor, something particularly important from a community process that is long. we have to step into the role of educators and workshop designers. From designing charrettes, some of the images are showing, to being a facilitator and learning about soil health, regenerative agriculture, and composting workshop as a way to grow and sustain will throughout this 4 to 5 years of design and community implementation process. Next slide. And every design feature can be turned into an educational process. Next slide, please. A retaining wall here is shown could be solved by a few timber members. It's upgraded to a process that have complexity of meaning, from salvaging foundation stone to building a gabion wall that is cost effective, something that laymen can participate and create a social space that retains soil for herb garden upslope and a rain garden downslope. Next slide. Yeah. And we work with Somerville High School Vocational Department to create a community composting corner. Sorry, I think the slide is skipping up ahead a bit early. One slide back, please. And we become orchestrators of meaningful relationships. And we work with Mass Art Community Build program, particularly with the architecture students, over a 10-week design build process during our pandemic summer to build a pergola structure for new event space. Next slide. Yes, next slide, please. And part of the renewal process is about continuing that collective inquiry through celebration. Yeah, here again, it's about regenerating the vocation through celebration at our opening. Next slide. Yes, so turning back to the idea of nested holes, one of the biggest learning curve that we have to build, I believe, is actually holding the different system of inquiry and to practice them simultaneously. So we always work with 3 lines, which means what the questioning has to start with what is required of me, what is required of the project and the team, but ultimately it is driven from what are we in service to, or what the project is in service to. Next slide. So at a personal scale, design education can be integral with building capacity around emotional intelligence. Here is a project that we work with high school students meditating prior to design and turning their senses to the land. So it's quite different from a typical site analysis process that we're used to. Next slide. And at the whole system scale, we could actively seek new entry points that move design upstream. So this is a visioning charrette, a project with Regenesis Group that we work with a foundation, in-house developer, and a community to design what a facility as well as an educational programming process look like for a civic engagement center. So moving, next slide, please. So wrapping up, it takes a level of brutal honesty to move thinking and being upstream. So I would encourage us to, instead of starting in the current paradigm, usually what we do and how we sustain what we do, to a very reflective process, as Carol and Bill had mentioned, and how we think about what we can do, to thinking about how we can observe how we become. And this is a lifelong practice. Next slide. And tying back to a very modernist philosophy, form follows function, then what? That is the question. No matter how green our technologies are, I think, and I believe, regeneration comes deeply from regenerating ourselves and the spirit and humanity's role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva, for taking us through your journey and showing us the power of expanding the roles we could play as designers to affect change. Now I'd like to thank one more time all our speakers for sharing with us your journeys and tools so we can, as a design community, implement them in our work. So now we're going to start the conversation or time for collective reflection. And I'm going to ask the audience to please engage with the questions through their own experiences, as we did in the first panel, through the chat, and to all the speakers to please turn on their cameras so we can have a face-to-face conversation. So maybe Walter, Thomas, and Etosa, could you turn on your cameras?
Adriana, it says unable to start video. I think I could try again. Here we go.
Okay, good to see you all again. Thank you. So from the questions that we're receiving, I believe that this first one is to Walter, or is addressed to Walter. So your work combines sort of a keen sensitivity to nature and communities while at the very forefront of science and policy changing. Can you share with us a bit about your journey and where this determination of work comes from?
I think it comes in two parts. One is cellular memory, and then the second is lived experience. And the best way to describe the cellular memory is to quote Tioka-san about decolonization of thought. And I think that comes from my late mother, who was born in the indigenous city of Chia in the northern Andes, a city of the Muisca people. And it was the origin of one of the many rebellions to decolonize what is today known as Colombia. And the Muisca Confederation believed that we're an accumulation of human experiences, conveying knowledge and power collectively rather than concentrating it. And to me, most importantly, the Muisca gods were women, and the earth Pachamama was inseparable from humans with equal rights and governance. And that's sort of, that epigenetic history that I feel is a continuum with what I do today, and, finding ways to decolonize my own thinking as well as the social processes that I engage with stakeholders in our work. And then the second part is a lived experience, as I mentioned before, which is, growing up in the islands, south of Florida, in the Keys, in Miami, the places with these extreme environmental conditions with, high wind and high salt, and a survivor of Hurricane Andrew, the Eye of Andrew, that, as Tioka-san mentioned, 9 of 10 teepees survived from the Seminoles. Meanwhile, the entire building code had to be rebooted because the wind resiliency codes that came out of South Florida post Andrew became part of the international building code. And seeing that transformation shaped my research. And then the last experience was before going to school. My family builds wooden sailboats, large wooden schooners by hand, using an adze, and going with my uncles into the forest with a 1-to-1 drawing of a grown knee of the frame of a sailboat to find a tree that fell in a hurricane and then regrew and then died, and to harvest that angle and bring it back into these boats. And they were lighter, stronger, and would sail them across the Atlantic Ocean to Portugal from the East Coast. And to me, the ocean is sort of one of the most liquid, raw, rapid feedback loops of nature. And seeing about 10 days out in the middle of the ocean, we ran into a garbage patch. And that garbage patch was the size of Rhode Island, and took 3 days to drift out from it, and learning that came from cities. And so that sort of redirected my thinking, going into landscape architecture at University of Florida and later at the GSD, which is we need to restructure the relationship between cities and nature. Cities aren't the enemy, but the way they currently have an extractive relationship with the ecosystem needs to be resorted so that we understand there's inseparability between people and nature, inseparability between cities and the social ecological systems that they sit within.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walter. And so Atosa, for example, you're doing this kind of so urgent, so interesting and needed work. And so this is a very direct question. And how do you imagine the design community supporting your efforts? And how do you envision this ecological bioregional planning to be, no? Because you're at this point where this is going to start and you need like the solution. So could you maybe enlighten us on how could we get there and support you?
Sure. Well, I'm the bioregional plan is in an iterative phase. We are in draft one, really, first draft, and it's been mostly a process led by Indigenous peoples and technical teams that have come up with basically a combination of life plans from the territories. Now we're attempting to do it, bring this out to the larger public, to civil society, to academia, to governments. Ultimately, we need governments to adopt sort of like a Green New Deal package of solutions in order to begin the implementation. We also need to bring together financial resources, technical resources, and really elevate the visibility of this model that's emerging from this region. So I think there's a lot to do, and I welcome input from people who've, definitely the work that you're all doing in greening cities. That's one of the biggest areas. In fact, when we came up with a cost estimate of what it would cost over 10 years to even roll out, the programs that we're imagining, cities were about half of that, because as was mentioned before, cities are like these nodes of destruction, centers for illegal clandestine activities, for pollution, also for the extractive economy, the clandestine economy that is basically eating away the forest. And cities that are in the Amazon, these urban centers, are growing at a rate of about 7 to 10% a year. And this is quite have been. I mean, maybe with COVID, they'll be less than that, but this is like a doubling every 15 to 20 years. And so obviously and the planning, the whole regime of planning has been all about urban planning. It hasn't been the urban forest interface. So I think for the design community, how do we educate planners, the next generation of planners that are coming out of schools? When we were looking for bioregional planning experts to help guide our process, there was only a few schools that even acknowledge this concept of bioregional planning. So I would say, this design community can be really helpful in transforming the profession of planning and urban planning to be more regenerative, more holistic, and also and then in terms of sacredheadwaters.org, you please go there and sign the declaration and join us and send us an email if you have, expertise. We're going to be going from the planning to, as I said, public evaluation, consultation, and participation. The process is really important, to political action and to campaigns, advocacy campaigns, but also to technical teams that are helping Indigenous peoples kind of deliver on some of these technology and solutions, basically. So I encourage you to get involved. There's enough pillars that covers every aspect of design. And then, I think that the big the questions have been said, we really need to go upstream and change the system. We need the systemic solutions that create fertile ground for all of this other solutions from the territories to emerge. So we have these two aspects. We have solutions from territories, from communities, from the bioregion, and then we have solutions that are needed at the national and global scale that address things like extractive economies. How do we transition the entire economic system and the financial system? The fact that Ecuador drills, for example, in the headwaters of the Amazon in order to service the debt, its national debt to China, debt to the IMF, etc. How do we change those structural solutions as well?
Okay, thank you very much. Here's a couple of questions from the public regarding, from the audience regarding asking what are the challenges for executing an ecology-based landscape project? What are these challenges, and whether there has been whether it has been ever difficult to convince about the idea. And also maybe this is a question regarding the challenges of the landscape that maybe Thomas, but also I can imagine Victoria answering and covering, but also if the other speakers wanna join.
Well, I'll jump in and thank you for the opportunity. I think it's a critical question. One of the great challenges is that people think that destructive, degenerative agriculture is the only way to produce enough food for the planet. And we need to explain to people that biological functionality of soils can be reestablished very quickly in 3 to 4 years. I love the keynote presentation by Professor Moreno, but I humbly push back on one comment that he made, that it takes a long time for ecosystems to recover. And that is not what we're finding worldwide. I have been working in many projects worldwide where full ecological functionality may be quite in the distance, but fundamental functionality is there very quickly. Working in the tropics, working in the Great Plains, we're seeing farmers in 3 to 4 years with increased ecological resilience, better water management, revived biology in the soil, greater yields, greater farmer profitability. So we need to have people understand that this is not something that's unattainably far off in the future, but if we start to farm regeneratively, it can pretty much turn on a dime. That's why Dr. Ratan Lal said that by the end of this century, if we farm regeneratively, we can actually draw down enough carbon to potentially reverse climate change. So I think that's an impediment, that people think that we don't have time. The time to start is right now.
Thank you. Maybe Victoria, you could also jump in from the perspective to this question from the perspective of biomimicry, and like how do you analyze the sites, and how do you inform design?
Yeah, actually, where my mind goes to this question is to the multiple kind of stakeholders that need to be aligned around a common purpose. It's almost like if we do our hard work at the beginning of the project, it really informs and empowers how we're actually able to move through it. And as you can imagine, on anything involving built environment, right, there's owners, designers, local community, local NGOs, local conservationists, business owners, neighbors, planners, other consultants, landscapers, all of it. And really being mindful and skillful about how we bring those groups together to understand what we're really hoping to achieve, which is to participate in nature's genius, right? Is, I think, a big sort of step and tool that we need to be mindful of in order to actually see the fruition that we want to bring. And we're learning our way into that still as well. I find that a lot of what I do and what we do as an organization is actually translate between the ecological world and the human world, translate between ideas of regenerative and more conventionally established notions of either doing less bad or being sustainable. When in fact, stasis or sort of maintenance or sustainability, as some would define it, doesn't even exist in the natural world. Every other species puts back and adds more value than it receives in order to create this emergent abundance and regeneration. So there's a lot of translation and nuance that needs to happen in a kind of container that's inclusive and collaborative, but also disruptive, in order for us to frame a project in a way that moves it kind of beyond conventional sense of what success looks like. I'd be really curious what other panelists have to say about that, though.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I think that one thing from Eva's presentation and work is that, she's at the forefront of expanding the typical role of an architect, of a designer. And so I was wondering, maybe about your ideas, Eva, but also all of you, on how can we shift design education away from the what and how, and educate the students, educate the new designers within a kind of a broader understanding and a regenerative understanding of our planet.
Yeah, I can chime in on that one. I think, and that's sort of the mission of how Terracotta emerged, is that as an architect, you know, how we have to go beyond our job description and a lot of times what we are contracted to do, and take on these, be brave enough to take on these additional roles, everything from being an educator to a co-learner. So for example, the Food Forest project, I wasn't even a landscape architect, but I actively actually seek out folks who are into a more holistic way of designing. And the project came to us actually, in fact, from a landscape architect, a professor at GSD, Anil Kirkwood. And he said that it's a bit hard to enter sometimes an academic environment with this kind of thinking, but there are other ways to gain traction. And so I started working from a more grassroots level, but my vision is always to actively seek ways to integrate those two. And I think design education could really be elevated if we actually, as a foundational training, you know, the way, how can we learn about system thinking? Not just system thinking, but living systems thinking as a foundational course, if you will. And that would combine a lot of and combine that with other reflective process, which Carol, Bill has encouraged us to do even during this 3-hour session. And all of the question and inquiry that has to happen throughout any design projects. I think that will really start to change the way designers, planners, and everyone, because it does take a specific language. It's a different language, and we have to also develop a kind of pattern reading mind, which is very amorphous and abstract at times, but is actually not so when we start to learn to activate those senses. So living system thinking and self-inquiry.
Great. I don't know if any one of you want to also jump into that question. Or we could also discuss, you know, how do we sustain meaningful design practices today? No, because it's difficult to balance sometimes the right thing to do, but also, you know, building resources and to support the work. So especially when it's for example, young designers. So maybe any of you have insight on this?
I'll jump in. You know, I don't necessarily know if I'm speaking to just designers. I think as a society, we are, you know, we really need to, at this moment in time, we're in this critical junction of our collapsing biosphere. The tipping point of many tipping points are being crossed. We have this COVID emergency that coming out of this COVID emergency is a portal to kind of push for a different path forward. And it's a collective process, I think, as planners, whether it's planning economic recovery or planning redevelopment of cities or planning restoration of nature. We're looking at, you know, 18 million hectares of forest that needs to be protected, and 8 million hectares of forest that need to be regenerated and reconnected in the Amazon, in this bioregion alone. So working from that perspective, I think that I love the work of Donella Meadows and the Donella Meadows Institute. It really helps us think about the goals of the system. Right now we have systems that are basically very much promoting monocultures and infinite growth. And what we really need is we need this idea of mutually flourishing human earth relationship. The idea of mutual benefit or mutual enhancing relationship, mutual flourishing is really defining different goals of the system. So how do we, how do we think about our world in a way that is creating mutual benefit? And I would say that, the work of the Sacred Headwaters Initiative, we really elevated the philosophical understanding of Indigenous peoples around Buen Vivir, this concept, Indigenous concept that comes from the Quechua Indigenous peoples that say, Sumak Kausai, the idea that everything is in harmony and reciprocity at all scales, from community, from family to community to forest to world, is this fractal patterns of reciprocity that we're really seeking harmony. That this indigenous concept of well-being, redefining economies of well-being, is really resetting a new compass heading. And that compass heading will help to self-organize. People can self-organize in meeting that new compass heading. And the other part of the indigenous concept that came through this the Sacred Headwaters bi-regional planning process was that it's a living forest. Everything is alive. Living earth, living forest. If we treat the forest as an organism, not as a resource, it reflects as sort of a paradigm shift. So I would say the other part of Donella Meadows' teachings is about changing the paradigm. And the paradigm here is that the earth is a living organism, Gaia, that we are in this harmonic co-flourishing with nature, and that not seeing the forest as just resources, not seeing planning as just urban planning, is really rethinking about our system goals and our paradigm of the way the living world requires us to step up and do it in an urgent way, because really we have very little time. So we have to find coherence in a short time. That's absolutely.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, but I'd like to, ask or invite each one of you to please advise our community with maybe one sentence conclusion on ways to step beyond the silos of design and become more proactive in creating cross-disciplinary partnerships to generate projects that can address the challenges we face. No, a bit like what you were speaking, Tulsa. So maybe, I don't know, Victoria, could you go first?
Ooh, I guess I would have to say that I feel like a lot of what has enabled and inspired the turn of my career at this stage of my life was following my gut and knowing that I have an inherent instinct that is my birthright that doesn't necessarily adhere to all of the frameworks that I may have been taught. It's sort of like one of the earlier speakers said, we've had all of the wisdom educated out of us. Go back to that gut, go back to that instinct, and know that that instinct has 3.8 billion years of intelligence built into it.
Okay, thank you. Walter, would you like to?
Yeah, as designers from the GSD, I can't help to think of aesthetics, right? And regenerative thinking is a form-finding operation, right? That our work, when you look at all of our projects in our portfolio, none of them are redundant. There's no code to it. It is coming from the place. And so, the aesthetic comes from each place or from the community that is the brain trust. And that is the core of local office's name, or Lola, is that the community is the brain trust. And we're just, conveyors of information and making sure that, the brain trust is not overlooked. And sometimes that brain trust is not just the community, it is the ecosystem that community resides within. And it's just a whisper, but we have software and we have ancient knowledge that can both take that whisper and show us what we're allowed to do, what the earth wants us to do there in that city.
Thank you very much. Thomas, I see that you've written in the chat, design is the direction of beauty.
So Mike, I'm glad you asked me to sum up quickly. We now know that biological diversity is the currency of survival as we hopefully rise to respond to our many ecological crises. And not only is it the currency of survival, but it's also more beautiful. So we can follow both our hearts and what science tells us and design into every productive system as much biological diversity as possible. So I'm excited by the opportunity to speak to all of you great designers, because our visions are aligned and we want to design beauty into every productive ecosystem.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up. I want to give you maybe Eva and Atosa the opportunity of very, very briefly in one sentence, say something if you want, or we can just wrap this up.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that 75% of the careers that will exist in 2030 don't even exist yet. So I think a big part of my personal journey is to actually create the projects, and every project is an entry point for creating beauty and polyculture of natural and human relationships. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll share a pedagogical comment, which is, Sarah Whiting, the new dean at GSD, has taken on the generational opportunity of reinventing the practice and discipline of design, how it's managed professionally and how it's developed academically. And I think this board, this presentation today, especially with the indigenous thought leaders, is going to get us beyond the century thinking and get us into the millennia thinking. And that future ancient is something that I wasn't able to get out of the GSD because of it was a materialist based, zeitgeist, forward-looking, modernist construct. And to get that ancient future, I had to go to MIT and take electives there, including Kevin Lynch's course, Theory of City Form, which was further taught by Julian Beinart. And that was the ecumenical city, looking back at the deep relation between, the ethical space and city making. And between MIT and GSD at the time, I could get what I was interested in, which is, to look deep past and in the deep future. But I think the transformation of the practice will come from regenerative thinking. Is sort of the next phase of thought in design.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our panel, and I'd like to thank you, the speakers, for your insights, for your time, for your energy, and to our audience for listening and joining the conversation. And finally, my sincerest gratitude to the amazing Haya Kader for creating this event and bringing all us together in moving forward a design agenda that enables a resilient future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'd like to invite our Chair of Design Impact to share some closing remarks. This has truly been an inspiring journey, and I'm deeply grateful to each and every one of our speakers, our moderators, and most importantly, our audience. Anna, please join us in thanking everyone.
Thank you so much, Haya. What a truly, truly brilliant event and panel. The thoughts and questions that have been shared today are beyond inspiring and will resonate with us for quite some time. So given the incredible gift presented by this event, I want to take this moment to express my gratitude on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council. First and foremost, I want to thank our event partners who are shown here on this slide. They helped us tirelessly promote our event today, allowing us to achieve our global reach. I also want to thank Hunter Tura of Syndicate Sub Rosa and his team of talented designers who made our web platform possible. Next on our gratitude necklace is our amazing Associate Dean of Development at the GSD, Peggy Burns, and her dedicated colleagues, Brad, Lindsay, Pamela, James, and Laura, who work tirelessly to make these events possible. I want to thank our fantastic team of event organizers whose faces you haven't seen today, but who are hard at work even as I speak. Thank you. I want to thank you, our incredible audience of global change makers, for participating in today's event. And finally, on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council, I want to thank our incredible panelists for the gift of their presence with us today, for their courage, their commitment, and to their inspiring work and vision. And finally, please join us for our upcoming Design Impact Summit. Registration details will be available on the Design Impact website, and we so hope that we can see you all again then. Please know that with every successive event, we strive to improve upon these conversations so that they are critical to building a culture of action and agency. In that spirit, I request you to share your comments with us through a post-event survey that you will receive in just a few moments. The conversations today have clarified many issues and raised other questions that strike at the core of design relevance in a staggeringly unequal world. We look forward to building a community of practice with you as we work together to bring forth a more beautiful and resilient world. For now, we take our leave. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.